Great and mighty, the moon and the stars declare who you are. I'm so unworthy, but still you love me. Forever my heart will sing of how great. Oh, you are holy, great and mighty, the moon and the stars declare who you are. I'm so unworthy, but still you love me. Forever my heart will sing of how great you are.
Hi. And you are? Well, yeah. Okay. Thank you, Stephen. So, my 6-year-old right now, and those of you who've been my students, you've heard a lot of stories about my kids. My 6-year-old can't eat bagels currently because several of his front teeth are so loose that the bagel might actually pop them free. You might be asking yourself, how does this happen? So my 8-year-old, just to give you a sense, when he was 3, I went in the backyard and found him on the roof of the garage. 3. And there's no easy accessible way onto the roof. He was just on the roof, and he's 3. And so the rain gutter is about 8 feet off the ground. I could just kind of reach up and barely touch it, right? So I discovered later the way that he gets up there is there's a piece of plywood sort of leaning against the garage, and if he ran as fast as possible across the yard through his body against the plywood, the spring action would launch him into the air and allow him to grab the gutter with 3 fingers and then pull himself up on the roof. So I go in the backyard, and he's up on the roof, standing there I'm here, right? And I walk back, I'm like, you can't be up there, you're 3, right? And he says, okay, Mom. And then he did what 3-year-olds do. So he's halfway up the roof, right? And he just begins to run down the roof and then throw himself into the air. Because I said, come down, and he took me literally. And actually, just to finish the story, he overshot my body. So, like a center fielder, I'm backing up while this little body is flying over my head. And I catch him in full extension, and he almost drops me to the ground. That's my 8-year-old. So my 8-year-old is in the front yard, is in the street with my 6-year-old, and we're still getting the details, but it has something to do with a skateboard, my 6-year-old, and then my 8-year-old. I'm not really sure how all mechanics work, but it ended up with my 6-year-old's face in the car. And another trip to the emergency room where we have frequent flyer miles. Okay. Creator God, I need your help today. Amen. Okay. I mean that. I was just at a retreat this weekend with a couple of churches and a bunch of folks in their 20s and 30s, and we were talking about sort of how to build relationships with other people who are different, right? And my wife and I were both sort of shocked by how many people said they don't have any relationships with people who are not Christians. And we were just surprised. I guess the world we live in North Portland, our post-Christian neighborhood, everybody we know are not Christians. That's just kind of normal life, but in this context, they weren't experiencing that. So today, I want to tell you a little bit about a friend of mine named Jesse. And so back when I was working on my master's degree, there was a pub in our neighborhood where I would go and I would study in the afternoons. And a pub is different than a bar. A pub is a public house, but a pub is a gathering place. It's a place you go for relationship and conversation. It's the neighborhood place where relationship happens. And this is where I would sit and I would do my studies, I would write my papers. And the afternoon server at this little pub was this delightful lady named Jessie. Jessie and I have been friends for a while. So I'm sitting there, and I'm working on a paper or something, and I have a book placed on the corner of the table, a religious book. And I like to do that. I like to leave like a book on the corner of the table when I'm hanging out in a public spot because books can be sort of like a quivering puppy dog, you know, like sort of begging people for attention. Come look at me, come play with me, you know. And that happens. And I can't tell you how many conversations I've gotten with people just because there's a book on the table that they find interesting and they stop by and we start chatting about it. You know, we're off in this great conversation, often about faith, often about God. So I've got this book out there, and Jesse's, there's just a few, maybe half a dozen people in the entire pub. Right? So she's kind of bored, but she wanders past the table, and she picks up the book, and she starts to look at it. It's a religious book. It's written by a guy named Brian McLaren. I think it was a book called The Story We Find Ourselves In. And she's reading the back cover, and the look on her face is sort of like that, oh, yeah, oh, okay, kind of look on her face, right? And while she's doing that, I'm sitting there and I go, and there's that sense inside of me, like you kind of know what's about to happen, like kind of you're going over the crest of a roller coaster and it's about to happen, like we're about to dive into a religious conversation, you know, you just kind of have that sensation. And while she's looking at it, all these sort of feelings and memories are coming up inside of me because having faith conversations can be sort of a complicated deal for people from, you know, different backgrounds. And I remember my very first time doing evangelism. And I was 16, and I remember that my youth pastor had told me that one way I was not being a very good Christian was I wasn't doing enough evangelism. So I remember I'm standing in the hallway at school, back then I was 5'2", 100 pounds, and bad at everything. I'm scrawny and pimple-faced, and I'm standing at my locker. Lovely lady named Layla walks up to me. And Layla and I are friends. And Layla has, you know, beautiful skin, green eyes, and long hair. And we get to chat, and she asked me if I go to church. And I said yes. And she said, so do I. She said, I'm a Jehovah's Witness. How about you? And I said, I'm not. So she said, interesting. We should talk more about that sometime. I said, okay. And then she sort of walked away, and then as she's walking away, she sort of looks back and she goes, how about after school on Friday? And I said, okay. And then she sort of flipped her hair and she went, what? As girls can do. And so this was like Tuesday. That gave me 72 hours to prepare for Friday. And so I did. I went to my church's library and I'm like checking out books and cassette tapes on how to talk to Jehovah's Witnesses because that was a big deal back in the 80s. You know, and so like I'm taking notes. I actually show up on Friday with index cards with notes on how to win the conversation. I'm not kidding. This is not an exaggeration, okay? So I show up, and after school, we sit down on the lawn, and I've got my cards out. And she sits down, and I'm like, okay, question number 1. And I start going into this thing, and she's like, oh, what's going on? I thought we were just going to hang out. And I'm like, yes, we are hanging out. Number 2, you Jehovah's Witnesses believe this? Here's why it's wrong, you know, and I'm going through this thing. And it was horrible. And she was horrified by the entire experience. And eventually, she said that I was being rude. She was rude. And after about 35 minutes, she grew tired of me and my routine. She got up and walked away. I still remember what it looked like, her back and her hair as she walked towards the bus station. And we were never really friends again. These are some of my feelings about evangelism. So I'm sitting in the pub, and Jessie's got the book out, right? She's looking at it, and she's got this sort of inquisitive look on her face. And see, Jessie and I know each other a little bit. Like, we hang out, you know, a few times a week in the afternoons, and we always get into conversations, because the pub's always pretty deep. So she knows about me and my family growing up in Eugene, and that I lived overseas, and I knew about her. She grew up out east. She was a writer, and she was working on a book. She told me many stories about her girlfriend and the two of them, and how she was really in love, and how great that was. And we'd had lots of conversations. This was the first time. She knew I was a religious person. So I wasn't worried about that piece of it. So then finally, she takes the book with a chuckle. She sets it down on the table. And as she walks away, she says this: Tony, Tony, you are a decent case for Christianity. She helps another table. And I'm left there with that. Possibly the greatest compliment I've ever received in my entire life. Right? So as a result of this, a few days later, we decided to get coffee sort of away from the pub. And we go to Paleo's Coffee House down in Ladd's Addition, and we're sitting on the roundabout, looking at the rose garden in the middle of the roundabout. We go and we get, I order just black coffee, and she gets something slightly more exotic. And she says she wants to smoke, and so we go, get a couple chairs, and go out to the parking berm, sit underneath this great big oak tree with huge branches. And we sit and we start to talk. She lights up. We're just chatting about life and getting kind of caught up. And then I say, how's the book coming along? She said, well, I'm about 3/4 way through it, and it's a lot my story, and I'm stuck. Because I'm trying to work through some of my childhood pain, and it's hard. And I said, I think so much of life is about trying to heal from our childhood pain. She said, what do you mean by that? Give me an example for you. I'm like, shoot. Because I was just trying to sound kind of smart and interesting. So I said, here's an example. I was raised to be extremely independent to a fault. And that independence and that drive and that sort of adrenaline addiction drove me to live all over the world in some really, really scary places. And when I was 28 years old, I was living in Yugoslavia during the NATO bombings of Kosovo. And it was a really, really tough time. I just lived hard for about 10 years. And my life fell apart. Because I was trying to prove to my dad and to my pastors, and I think to God, that I was worth something. Because that's the way I've been raised. And that led to burnout and pain for me. To the point that I became the worst version of myself. And there's this moment when I'm 29, sitting in my apartment, my little flat on the second floor, when I'm literally at the lowest point I've ever experienced in my life, and I have this really intimate encounter with God. It's really hard to explain, but it was extremely intimate. And I felt like God met with me, and it felt to me like Jesus. And it's one of the most healing things that's ever happened to me, even though my life was falling apart. Jessie looks at me sort of cocky, her head cocked. She's like, wow, thank you for trusting me with that story. I was like, well, you're welcome. She says, I'm so glad that religion gives you that. But you need to know that religion doesn't work for me. In fact, this tree tells me as much about God as any religion could. And we just sat there staring up into the branches. And it was silent for a long time. I think so much of faith relationship is just about creating space. Creating space, sitting at a table at a pub, or letting silence drift through a conversation. giving each other space and being expectant of what might happen without having to force the agenda. Jesus was really good at this. Luke chapter 4 is just hanging out in the synagogue. How many stories are there where he's just sort of wandering down the road and he notices someone that no one else would notice because he was just sort of lingering or making space? Stories where he's just hanging out on the side of a hill and suddenly one of the gospel writers is like, that's important enough to write a story about. There's stories about Jesus, many, where he's just hanging out at a table, having dinner with folk. And inevitably, the people are referred to as sinners. There's this great lyric by Rich Mullins talking about Jesus. The whores all seem to love him, and the drunks propose a toast. Jesus would linger with people. And in John chapter 4, there's a story about a woman, a Samaritan woman, that Jesus probably shouldn't be talking to. But at the beginning of the story, Jesus is just hanging out at this watering hole. It actually says he's been sitting there for a while, long enough that the disciples have had time to disappear and go away. And then this woman walks up and he gets in a conversation. The other thing I love about human interaction that Jesus models is this fascination with the other person. If one person can just believe that the other person thinks that they are dazzling, that their story is eternally important, it's amazing how easy it is to dive in together and be there. If one person can just believe that my life is as interesting as, say, watching a blockbuster movie, it's that interesting to you, it's amazing how much I will give to you in a conversation. And in John chapter 4, Jesus learns her story, her beliefs, and her pain by just lingering and being dazzled by her. So after a long pause, I turn to Jessie and I'm like, tell me more about the tree. She says, the tree inspires me, and it reminds me of God. God's creativeness, the fact that God cannot be contained. Look at the direction these branches are going. It's totally unpredictable. It says protection. It says comfort. It says power. And I say, Jesse, this might sound weird, but I think if Jesus was sitting here, he would agree with you. She said, really? And I said, yeah, there's this place in the Christian scriptures that says, since the very beginning of creation, God's invisible attributes, his divine power, and something have been clearly revealed through things that are made, like a tree. So it literally says that this tree is supposed to teach us about what God is like. She thought that was kind of surprising, that she would agree with the Christian concept. So Jesse and I, we kind of chatted for a while, but there was something I wanted to get around to that I'd kind of been waiting for. So I finally said, Jesse, the other day you said to me that I make a pretty decent case for Christianity. First of all, you need to know that's one of the greatest compliments I've ever received in my whole life. And secondly, at least I hope it was, and I kind of looked at her and she nodded and she's like, yes, I meant it as a compliment. I'm like, good. If you were being sarcastic, that would hurt my feelings. And I said, okay. And I said, I'm just curious what you meant by that. And what she said, Tony, you're a good guy. You're actually a decent guy. And kindness can be surprising when it comes in certain packages. like Christian packages? She said, yes. So this led us on a little bit of an adventure of a conversation, as you might guess. I was asking her impressions and experiences of Christianity, and she was sort of dodging the topic a little bit. Eventually I asked her, what words would you use to describe Christianity? She said, religious, opinionated, and then a pause. Hateful. Period. And I said, Jesse, what's the first story about a Christian that comes to your mind? And her eyes went from me out across the street and over the rose bushes. And she said, there was a time when my girlfriend and I were walking through downtown Portland, and we were holding hands, and it was a lovely day, and we were laughing. And it was rush hour, and cars were going by, and there was this man screaming from across the road that we didn't notice because of all the noise. But other people were looking at him, and so we looked over, and he was staring at us. And the man was screaming over the traffic. He was calling us names, like dykes and other things. He said that we were evil. He said that we were sinners. And he said that God was looking forward to sending us to hell. He said, Jesse, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. She stopped. She kind of snapped out of, she's sort of in a daze as she's telling the story. She looks at me and she goes, you don't have to be sorry. It has nothing to do with you. That's some jerk on the street. And I looked at her very, very seriously and I said, Jess, there's some things I'm learning about myself. And this stuff may not make total sense, but God is my parent. And Jesus is my Savior. And Christianity is my family. And I have to accept that I have solidarity with that man on some level. And in that, I have to beg you for forgiveness. And I will understand if you can't give it to me. And we sat, and she just stared at me. Sort of, furrowed brow and mouth kind of half open. And she just stared at me for a while. And then she said, I forgive you. And I said, thank you. I would consider that one of the loveliest afternoons of my life. With somebody who trusted me, shared her pain, and I was able to share some of mine, and we were able to talk about God. I think these kinds of conversations can happen all the time, if we're available to. At the end of the conversation, well, not even the end, but Jesse says to me, would you please tell me what you believe? And I said, if I lost this, there we go. She said, would you tell me what you believe? And I said, I'll try. And then I reached into my story right at that moment, the things that I was feeling that I believed, or something like this. There's an ancient piece of art made in Russia that tells the story of God. That God lives in community, a community of love. Lost and enraptured in this community of love. And the love was so great that had flowed over and creation happened. And God created everything that we see. And God loved his creation so much that creation had the ability to sort of hurt God in the sense of rejection. And that's what happened in the story from the beginning of the Bible. And out of that, God has been chasing me and you and all of creation throughout all of time. And then I went on to walk through the scriptures and talk about Jesus. And she just listened. I talked for like 25, 30 minutes telling the story, and she wandered with me along the way. And at the end of our conversation, after sitting there under that oak tree for probably 2 hours, we were better friends than when the conversation began. And I believe that faith conversation does not need to drive people apart, but that it draws people together. When it's with honesty and care and affection, we are surprised what happens because friendship happens. God, I want to thank you for these friends, and that you would invite us to be with you in this room. And I pray that all of us would learn to build spiritual friendships. That you would help my heart and my selfishness in the ways that I block other people out. That I would live my life open and free as Jesus did. That I would walk down the streets and sit in cafes and look for opportunities at all times to build spiritual friendships with others. Amen.
You are my strength that keeps me walking. You are the hope that keeps me trusting. You are the light into my soul. You are the purpose. You are everything. And how can I stand here with you and not be moved by you? Would you tell me how could it be? Yeah.